So this morning, we're really just going to talk about what's happening politically in wilderness, both with some current bills on the floor and then with all of the 30 by 30 work that's happening and how wilderness might factor into that. And we are lucky enough to have with us Athan Manuel, who's the director of the Lands Protection Program for the Sierra Club. While there, he oversees legislative efforts to protect and designate public lands, such as national parks, wildlife refuges, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and national forests. He also defends endangered species and works on the Endangered Species Act and works to stop any new oil and gas drilling on public lands. Before working at the Sierra Club, Athan worked for the public interest research groups. He was the director of preservation programs for US PIRG and ran campaigns to protect ANWR and other public lands, national forests, oceans, and again, the Endangered Species Act. So Athan, I will let you take it away. We're just gonna have Athan talk for a while about what he does and what's happening, and then we will open it up for folks to ask questions.
Great, thanks, Heather. Thanks for inviting me to speak to y'all today. As Heather said, my name is Athan Manuel. I work for the Sierra Club and coming to you from Washington, D.C. in my backyard here in upper Northwest Washington, D.C. But I've lived in D.C. since '93 and have been a full-time lobbyist since 1998. But as she mentioned, started as an organizer with the PIRGs for a long time. And now I apologize, you can hear my neighbor's crazy dog who has some challenges, I think. But I just want, I want to talk for a little bit about, talk about two things, obviously, as Heather talked about, 30 by 30, and then what's happening here on the Hill. And it is interesting when you look at public lands, though, in general, when you step back. Like I mentioned, I've been in Washington for a long time, and the shorthand is that it's just hard to get stuff done and that we're running in place and there's no bipartisan agreement on anything. But when you do look at public lands, there is a lot of times bipartisan agreement on these issues, and we can actually get some stuff done. And just in the last 15 years, we've been able to pass 3 really large public lands bills. In 2009, we got 3 million acres protected, the largest single increase in the wilderness system since the Wilderness Act was passed in 1964. A smaller bill in 2014 passed. That was kind of a mixed bag, but had some good things in it, as well as some bad things. And then just 2 years later, 2 years ago in 2019, with a Republican Senate and Republican House and a horrible president, we were able to get a really large public lands bill passed that again had 3 million acres 3 million acres protected, and for the first time ever got us 700,000 acres of wilderness in southern Utah, which the last time that had happened was never, I think. So there is a lot of common ground on this kind of stuff, and we can get these things over the finish line, because I think the strength we've got in this movement is that, the jury is in with the American public. America loves public lands. They don't take them for granted. They understand how important they are to local economies, to public health. And increasingly, we've seen it in the last year and a half with the coronavirus, that they're really important for our mental health, and that nature bathing and getting outside has never been more important for people's physical and as well as now their mental health. And I hope that crow isn't mocking me over my shoulder. I hope you guys can't hear that. But anyway, no, really, they're really good for your mental health. Leave me alone. And so it is a great movement to work on it. And I think even with all those advantages, it is interesting that not that we're competitive with other parts of the movement, but obviously the big issue, the existential issue we're working on right now as a community is climate change. And for a long time, I wouldn't say we struggled, but for a while it was a challenge to make sure that working on public lands and wilderness issues, that work is seen as something complementary to the fighting climate change. And for a long time, that overlap was around fighting oil and gas and coal mining, or oil and gas drilling and coal mining on federal lands. Obviously, those things cause climate change, and we think our public land should be part of the solution, not the problem when it comes to climate. So that was one hook. But I think one thing that's really helped us politically on the Hill and with the White House now, and even with the public, is the 30 by 30 campaign and this recognition that that we need to protect more public space and more public land if we're going to ensure that these habitats and for endangered for species and plants survive the current climate crisis. And so I think that was really so I think 30 by 30 has been a great hook for us to connect public lands campaigns explicitly with fighting climate change. And so that's really helped us out quite a bit. So that's just a little bit of the framing to where we are now. And obviously the elections last year were huge. I mean, there's no way to quantify how important it was to both get rid of President Trump, who obviously for a variety of reasons was a horrible person or is a horrible person, but especially for their promotion of oil and gas and coal and trying to turn the clock back when it came to energy policy on federal lands. But also having someone like Joe Biden become president was just a massive win for us as a species and a planet and as a movement on public lands. Even though Biden wasn't on most of the environmental committees during his time in the Senate. I mean, I remember lobbying him. Last time I talked to him, I can tell you, it was 2008, obviously, when he was running for vice president. And I got the whole full Biden treatment. You know, he put his hand on my shoulder and put his finger in my chest and said, that vote in 2005 to save the Arctic Refuge was one of my proudest moments as a U.S. Senator. You know, and you go tell Sierra Club that, you know, and so so having someone who kind of gets it on public lands and oil and gas drilling was huge. But then obviously he committed publicly before as part of his campaign to keep dirty fuels in the ground, to protect the Arctic Refuge from drilling. And then they committed early on to this 30 by 30 goal of protecting 30% of the US by 2030. And they've kind of backed that up a little bit in terms of on day one, when the president issued all these new climate orders, 30 by 30 was part of that. So on day one, we had the US executive branch, at least, the executive branch of the US government commit to protecting 30% of our public lands by our country as public lands by 2030. And that's a huge statement to have that be the statement of the president of the United States on day one. They've followed that up subsequently, obviously, with this America the Beautiful report, which again kind of did two things. One, it was nice that they kind of doubled down on making 30 by 30 a priority, but obviously left a lot of room for us to fill in the blanks on how they actually get there. So it was very aspirational in terms of what we want to shoot for, but didn't have a lot of lines on the map. And that's really what we need to do as a movement, right? Is to fill in the blanks on those and help us as a country and as a movement get to 30% by 2030. And the good news is we are making progress on that front on the Hill. And it's kind of interesting when you look at what we've got in the mix, because we still want to try and get stuff done congressionally, right? That's still the best way to get anything done, is have Congress act to protect an area, since Congress is in charge of federal lands. And but if that fails, and obviously with the Senate being 50-50 and the House margins being a little tight, who knows if we're going to be able to get stuff over the finish line congressionally. But it's good that we obviously have in our back pocket the Antiquities Act, which, as you guys know, gives the president the authority to designate areas as protected lands through executive action. And so that's kind of the playbook we used under the Obama administration, where, as you guys probably remember, the first 2 years of his administration, we got a lot of good stuff done through Congress, and we got that 2009 Wilderness Act passed as one good example. But obviously after the 2010 midterms, congressional action wasn't likely. And so we pivoted to a monument strategy, where we were working with the administration to use the Antiquities Act to designate new national monuments. And at the end of his second term, you saw that President Obama had protected more acres of public land than any president in the history of the United States. And that was true even if you take away some of the really huge ones he did in the oceans. You know, the Pacific Remote Islands National Monument was a huge area in terms of acreage. But even if you take that away, he's still the president who's protected the most public lands via the Antiquities Act. And so that's kind of our 1-2 punch, is we want to get stuff done through Congress, ideally, is probably the best way to do that. But if we fail on the Hill, and we can then pivot back to a monument strategy and have that as plan B for us. But like I mentioned, we're off to a really good start hill-wise, because we are seeing some, at least on the House side, some pretty quick action on public lands bills. And I'll just say that I'll just champion right at the very beginning. We're lucky in that on the House side, we've got some really, really strong champions who really understand the need for protecting public lands. Raul Grijalva, who is the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, is a phenomenal advocate, thinks of things the same way, at least Sierra Club does, but I think most environmental groups do. And when we meet with the staff and they tell us what their agenda is, I mean, sometimes we do this at the beginning of every Congress, and we'll sit down and talk with them, and they'll say, well, what else, what is on y'all's agenda at the Sierra Club? I said, well, you guys just said it. I mean, you enumerated our agenda too, which is to be aggressive on protecting public lands and keeping fossil fuels in the ground. But then also, we've got some great champs on that committee, and especially what's happening this Congress, the person who's been driving most of our public lands work on the House is Congresswoman Dinah DeGette from Denver, Colorado, who's just been a real phenomenal resource and advocate, but has a great team of other members of Congress around her. And most of the work on the House side is coalesced around this umbrella bill called the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act, so PAW Plus. Obviously, the Protecting America's Wilderness spells PAW, but the way the House talks about it, which is kind of clever, I guess, is that when you add public lands to it, that's plus, PL equals plus. So it's, the shorthand is PAW Plus. But that bill is a collection of bills that are just great pieces of legislation. In Colorado, she's got her own bill, the Colorado Wilderness Act, which protects WSAs that had been recommended as wilderness by the BLM for about 25 years ago, and knits them together into a very large package of bills in Colorado. There's another bill, the Colorado Outdoor Recreation Economies Act, sponsored by Congressman Neguse from Boulder, Colorado, another great bill that protects hundreds of thousands of acres in Colorado. And also for Sierra Club, at least from our perspective, also protects an area important to our history called Camp Hale, which is where David Brower served in the 10th Mountain Division during World War II. And David Brower was the first president of the Sierra Club. And the 10th Mountain Division, even before David Brower joined the club, was trained in alpine skills by Sierra Club volunteers. And that training and those and some of the technology that was developed around the 10th Mountain Division is what oftentimes is credited with starting the modern ski industry. So a huge economic impact from just the training of the 10th Mountain Division. And from Sierra Club's perspective, we're very proud to say we helped defeat Hitler in World War II by training the 10th Mountain Division. So we're one of the few groups that has helped stop Nazis historically. That's how old Sierra Club is. So we have a great anti-Nazi background, which we're very proud of. And so those two bills are part of the PAW Plus Act. Then you've got Raul Grijalva has the Grand Canyon Protection Act, which would permanently ban uranium mining in an area outside of the Grand Canyon National Park, and would protect some sites that are very important to local indigenous peoples who've had trouble with water contamination from previous mining of uranium in that region. The Wild Olympics bill in Washington State, another bill that's important to indigenous peoples in the Olympic Peninsula that would protect hundreds of thousands of acres there in Washington. And then four California bills are part of the bill. The Rim of the Valley Act, which protects some of the few open spaces left outside of Los Angeles, California. San Gabriel's bill, which would codify and increase protections for national forests lands outside of LA. And then the Central Coast Heritage Act, and which protects areas in Central California, obviously near Santa Barbara. And then the Northwest California Wilderness Act, which is a bill by Jared Huffman that would protect areas in Trinity County and areas north of Marin County. So a phenomenal package of bills that are sponsored by some great folks on both the House and Senate side. And Dinah DeGette got this bill passed once in the previous Congress in 2020. And then one of the first things they did this year in Congress was pass the PAW Plus Act in February of this year in the House. And so, and both times this bill had 4 votes, DeGette referenced how important the PAW Plus bill is as part of the 30 by 30 campaign. In fact, when she gave the floor speech in February of 2020 about those bills, I think it was the first time ever that 30 by 30 had been referenced on the floor of the House. So a little bit of history there on that one. And those bills that got even stronger as they moved through committee, we were able to attach two wilderness bills on the East Coast. One is to designate some wilderness in the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia and North Carolina, and then do some national forest wilderness in the Shenandoah Mountains that border Virginia and West Virginia. So you even got some East Coast stuff in there, which is always good to do. And so, and then there's a bunch of other bills that are probably going to pass sometime in the House this year. You know, the Chaco Canyon Protection Act, which will create a 10-mile buffer around Chaco Canyon National Historic Park in New Mexico. We think Oak Flat, a bill to ban the expansion of uranium mining, copper mining in Arizona, near Resolution, Arizona, by that Resolution Copper Company in Superior, Arizona. And so some good stuff's happening on the House. I could give great motivated champs, and you have a majority led by Nancy Pelosi. And you've probably picked up on some of this, but you know, we want to. Climate change is helping drive a lot of these public lands campaigns under the 30 by 30 umbrella, but also it's really the other thing we're hearing a lot about from an issue that has just finally gotten to the forefront is working on issues and bills that are very important to Indigenous people, and that's kind of you know, rectifying a wrong. And it's kind of poetic, obviously, to work on those kind of issues from an Indigenous perspective, since even though we are very proud of our public lands here in the United States, we have to acknowledge that most of those public lands were stolen from the Indigenous folks who were here before Europeans came to North America or to this hemisphere. And so we do think it's kind of just an equity and justice issue to do more work on issues that are important to Indigenous peoples. And when you look at Grand Canyon and Wild Olympics in particular, those issues are very, very important to local Indigenous groups. Same with Chaco Canyon and Oak Flat. So all those areas, all those bills are very important. And then Heather mentioned it in my bio, and the issue I've worked on for the longest probably is the protecting the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge from oil and gas drilling. We think we're going to undo what was done in the 2017 Tax Act this year via the Budget Reconciliation Act. That's also a very important priority campaign for environmental groups around the country. But that campaign's always been led by local Indigenous people from the Gwich'in Nation, you know, a transnational Indigenous group that lives in Canada and in Alaska, who consider the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge the sacred place where life begins, and they want to see that area permanently protected. And so we're working on that issue too. So, and that one, we actually have a really good shot of getting that one done both in the House and the Senate via the Budget Reconciliation Act. But that's really the challenge moving forward. I mentioned the House side is really strong, and we're doing great stuff there on the House side. But the Senate's going to be a constant battle. You know, I referenced some of those other those public lands bills that passed even when Republicans were in charge. We were able to get some Republican lands bills included in those proposals, but now every year the bigger challenge for us, especially on the Senate side, has been that public lands are seen as more and more of a partisan issue. They used to be seen as bipartisan. You know, you do have a Republican history of doing public lands work, whether it's going back to Teddy Roosevelt or even more recently, Orrin Hatch was from Utah, which is always crazy to say. Was the driving force in 2019 in getting that public lands bill passed, because we worked with him and we negotiated with that office for months to get that wilderness bill over the finish line for Southern Utah, and that was Orrin Hatch's legacy. It was not a coincidence that he was retiring and won a legacy bill like that, and we were able to get that over the finish line. But it's getting harder and harder on the Senate side because you just see more and more of an ideological stubbornness from Republicans when it comes to lands bills. And so that'll be our big challenge on the Senate side this year, is making sure that we can get Republicans to at least not block some of these bills from moving, and trying to find Republicans who want to do lands bills. It's just harder and harder every year to find someone who wants to do something, it seems like, on that issue. But we're optimistic about getting all these public lands bills done through the Senate, because we do have other must-pass bills that we think we can attach them to on the Senate side. And so I mentioned Arctic will probably get protected in the Senate side via the Budget Reconciliation Act. But there are some other must-pass bills. You know, we think the Democrats are going to do some kind of tax reform package that Republicans will be hard-pressed to resist. We think that could be a vehicle for attaching public lands bills to, in part because Ron Wyden from Oregon, who's a good public lands champ, is chair of the Finance Committee. So he would be open to attaching all these POP Plus bills, we think, to that kind of package. And then the last thing, the other vehicle that we've used historically in the past has been the National Defense Authorization Act, which is what sets the funding priorities for the Defense Department. And obviously with the Defense Department, that's catnip for Republicans. They don't want to vote against the defense bill. And so we think that'll be a good way that'll be a good thing for a good Christmas tree for us to hang PAW Plus or other environmental bills onto it. With the excuse that, I mean, I mentioned Camp Hale because it's important to Sierra Club, but that there are some Department of Defense related issues to some of these bills. And so that's our excuse for attaching them onto those public lands bill, onto an unrelated bill like the Defense Authorization Act. But bottom line, we're optimistic about this stuff because of the fact that we do have incredible public support for protecting public lands. And so that was true even before 30 by 30 became a big deal. That was true even before climate change became a front page of the paper story. And that was true even before we started emphasizing how important these bills and this movement is to Indigenous peoples. But that's really our ace in the hole. And so that's why the work that y'all are doing is so important. It's because none of this stuff happens organically. And y'all's name kind of refers to what we need to do. We need to have more wilderness stewards who are actively pushing this kind of stuff. Because one thing you learn from doing a lobby campaign in Washington is that the only thing that works is persistence. Is to consistently and constantly apply pressure and show support for these kind of bills, and to do that every day until we finally win. You know, you need money, you need press work, you need clever lobbyists in Washington who know how to maneuver the halls of the Capitol, but you mainly need that grassroots pressure that's constantly applied to push these bills over the finish line. So it's great that you guys are doing this kind of work. And I'm not just saying that just because Matt Kirby is active with you guys. Matt's one of my favorite people. He used to work for me for years here at Sierra Club. But we've got a great agenda on the table that's got some traction, and we just got to keep pushing this year to get that over the finish line. And I'm still optimistic that we can get that done. So thanks for letting me pontificate a little bit about these issues and these campaigns. I'm happy to take questions if you guys need more information about some of these issues or where we are in some of these campaigns or other issues moving through the Hill.
That's awesome, Ethan. Thank you so much. I have a couple questions so I can get us started off. And for any of the rest of you guys who have questions, if you can just write stack in the chat, and then you'll have the floor. We have a small enough group. I think it's fine if folks just take themselves off mute and we can really just have a conversation. But writing stack sometimes helps if you're afraid of speaking at the same time somebody else is. So let's see. I have so many questions here. What do you think? You know, we've all seen how 3030 is rolling out, and here where I'm at in Colorado, there's definitely some misinformation campaigns happening in the more rural areas. Do we have any Republican advocates of 3030? What is the partisan nature of 3030 on the Hill? Are people pretty dug in, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, they are pretty dug in, sadly, on that point, Heather. What's interesting about it is, or I don't know if interesting is the right word. I guess sad is the right word for it. What's sad about it is for the base of the Republican Party now, and I do work with a lot of Republicans. You know, Mike Simpson, John Curtis, Orrin Hatch. You know, we've done a lot of great work. So I don't want to sound like I'm just bashing Republicans, but a large part of their base really does believe that the Democrats are socialists who want to turn us into a Soviet-style country, right? And they do, and they think that's the way to attack 30 by 30. So even though it's meant to permanently protect existing public lands. The way they talk about 30 by 30 is that this is the government going to seize land from private landowners and make it part of the federal estate. And that's definitely not what it is. You know, we are kind of, as you guys know, there's just a lot of BLM land that is just sitting up there that is a wilderness study area or doesn't have any kind of permanent designation. And so that's what 30 by 30 is designed to do. And I saw someone put in the chat that, you know, 30 by 30 basically just says we need to protect, in order to provide enough connectivity for species and habitats to survive the stresses of climate change, we need to protect 30% of the United States by 2030 and make that number 50% by 2050. And you see a lot of examples of that. I mean, and you see it sometimes with infectious diseases. In fact, the most recent example I saw was that people have probably heard of Lyme disease. That's named after Lyme, Connecticut. And that's a disease born by ticks who used to live exclusively on deer, but we've wiped out all the deer in that part of New England. And so it started first in Lyme, Connecticut, but those parasites jumped from deer to humans. And that's just one example of how if we wipe out open spaces and wipe out habitats for animals, we may see more examples like that happen in the future. And so, and climate is making all those issues worse. And so the idea is we need to just make sure we have that open space to allow for current habitats and ecosystems to survive what's happening with climate change. But that's where, but in the specifics, that's what we're trying to do, is just permanently designate areas that currently don't have a permanent designation. But Republicans are cutting it as some kind of private, as literally the government showing up with guns, telling you you have to give the government back your ranch. And so it gets whipped up in this fever dream of Cliven Bundy and all these other guys in the West. And so it is sad how Republicans have seized on that a little bit.
And is there a space for private lands in 30 by 30 as far as conservation easements? Is that kind of their entry point, that then they're making this huge thing, which of course is something you can choose to do or not?
Yeah, that is part of it. Yeah, but that's a huge part of it. If you look at the America the Beautiful report that the Biden administration put out, there's a huge emphasis on providing incentives for private landowners to do more conservation and do conservation easements or other kind of agreements like that. Right. So, yeah, no one's, I mean, you guys know this, you've been in the United States your whole life probably. There's no one trying to take anyone's land from the government. So, but that's the Republican talking point. That's the best argument they've come up with, at least. I don't think it works, but that's what they've come up with. And it has scared people, I think, though, especially Democrats from the Intermountain West, frankly, who are up for re-election, definitely are worried about some kind of Republican blowback or reaction to 30 by 30 or to a permanent ban on oil and gas drilling, for instance. So it does cause some political nervousness among Democrats too.
That's too bad. We have one more 30 by 30 question right now, and then Pete will get to your question. But it looks like Tristan was wondering if there's components of 30 by 30 that push for smarter urban planning.
You know, it's not a big part of it, it's actually, but, you know, we're actually working to do more on that, for instance, at the Sierra Club, because we do see the connection between sprawl, obviously, and bad growth, unintelligent growth. What's it? What are the opposite of smart growth? But, you know, and climate change, right? And in fact, there's a bill called the Southern Nevada Economic Development and Conservation Act, SNEDCA. They couldn't come up with a better acronym than SNEDCA. In Nevada, that, you know, Senator Cortez Masto, who's great, a real champ on this issue, has introduced that has some really good public lands bills provisions in it, but it has some very bad provisions, we think, obviously around Clark County, you know, where most of the population growth is in Southern Nevada, that we think would lead to sprawl, which we think would lead to greater greenhouse gas emissions. And so we are trying to push that. It's not a big part of it, but we're trying to push it. And some other groups trying to push that urban planning and stopping sprawl and conversely promoting more mass transit in particular is a better way to go, and making that part of 30 by 30. But it's baby steps for now on that issue.
Yeah, that's a great point. Pete, go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Heather, and Athan, thank you. Learned a lot already. Been scribbling quickly while you've been along with wildlife in your backyard there. So
Thanks.
hey, I just not sure I'll phrase this particularly well, but given the fact that a wilderness designation is an add-on designation to land that's already in public ownership, and so one school of thought would be that land is already protected, and putting energy into getting additional wilderness designations may not be as important to putting energy to getting more public land designations, maybe through monuments. So I wonder if you could just speak to that and the fact that wilderness is never a designation that puts land initially into federal management.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, Pete. We want to push for wilderness because it's the highest, we think the best and highest standard, obviously. But we're agnostic. I mean, we would take anything, right? National conservation area, national recreation area, as long as it's kind of a permanent designation that would prohibit any kind of industrial development in the future. So even like national recreation areas, we're open to that because we want, our motto at Sierra Club especially is, enjoy, explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. We want people to go out and visit these public lands. And so yeah, I think you're right. We always shoot for the moon. What's that cliche? Shoot for the stars and you'll at least reach the moon. And so yeah, we'd like to see wilderness, but yeah, we're flexible on what kind of designation we get. Because yeah, monuments is a good example. And I think on monuments, especially, we're very flexible there, and we like the way Obama did monuments a lot, where he did large landscape protections, but also small ones to tell undertold parts of American history. Whether that was Stonewall, the Stonewall Inn in New York is a national monument, even though it's a private tavern. But it highlights the start of the LGBTQ rights movement. So we like to flex, but yeah, we're flexible. We want to shoot for wilderness where we can, and that's probably better to be done through congressional designation, right? So that's why I think the PAW Plus is the best way to do wilderness. But when it comes to monuments, yeah, we're flexible.
Thanks.
So Stephen has a related question, and then Nate will get back to you. So Stephen, go ahead with your question. I saw you start typing in the chat.
Yeah, I've heard conversation over the past year about we don't need more wilderness areas because we can barely manage them as is. But I'm wondering, in relation to Pete saying that, does creating new public lands feed into the "we're stealing your land" argument? The government's coming to steal your land, as opposed to, because that's what happened with the famous monuments that Obama was doing and instigated all that again, as opposed to new wilderness currently in public land system.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that is what both those arguments, the arguments Republicans use, right? That it's funny on that first one, we can't even manage the lands we have now. Well, that issue ebbs and flows depending on an election year, right? So one of the great things we got done last year was the Great American Outdoors Act, which permanently reauthorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund. In that public lands bill we passed in 2019, we permanently reauthorized it. I'm getting those backwards, but we permanently reauthorized it in 2019, then permanently funded it in 2020. And that funding bill in 2020 also included $11 billion for the park maintenance backlog. There's a $13 billion backlog, and we got $11 billion in that bill. And the big champ for that bill was Cory Gardner from Colorado and Steve Daines from Montana, and because they were in tough re-election races. And so Republicans will say we can't manage our public lands until they're up for re-election, and they realize, oh wait, people like public lands. I should be for getting rid of the public lands backlog. I mean, that bill had been stuck until, I think you guys probably remember this story. Cory Gardner went to the White House and said, listen, I'm getting creamed in my re-election bid. I need a win. Give me this bill. And all of a sudden, Donald Trump was supportive of permanently funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I don't think Donald Trump could spell LWCF, but then he became a big champ of it when Cory Gardner told him he needed it for his re-elect. So So yeah, I think that's one challenge we have to meet, but I think on both those issues, and the stealing your land thing, we just have to stay on message, right? We have to say, look, we're not stealing your land. We're talking about permanently protecting existing federal public land, whether it's state land, federal land, or municipal land. Because we just can't let them define that. We just have to be better at defining it than they are, right? But that's going to be their argument until they find another one that works. That one hasn't worked. I mean, that one scares Democrats a little bit, who are again up for re-election. But I think again the public kind of gets it when it comes to these issues, and so I think we just have to be real confident in how we talk about these things. Because if we do, we're going to get the public on our side. We just got to be confident, not let them define how we define these, not let them define the terms of the debate.
Go ahead, Lisa, and then we'll come back to you, Nate.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for offering your expertise today. So I have a somewhat unrelated but related question, and it's about sort of political activism related to appropriations, in the sense that, you know, I think a lot of times we as an advocacy community focus really heavily on getting public lands protected, and we're coming to a point where the tension between the funding available for lands and the funding available for lands, the need and the availability are really coming to a head. And I think we're seeing some resistance emerging from the agencies on new designations because they don't have the money to manage them. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about maybe what Sierra Club and some of the other heavy hitters are doing related to appropriations, and if there are ways that we as other groups can assist or be active in that arena.
Yeah, well, one, thanks for using the word expertise. That was nice. Thanks. Lisa, you used to work with Vicky, didn't you? You used to work with Vicky Hoover back in the old days.
I still work with Vicky Hoover. I love Vicky Hoover.
Yeah,
I love her. Yes, but yes, I did the 50th anniversary work. I'm also active in wild and scenic rivers, and so that's kind of where we've gotten some major pushback from land management agencies related to, I think, particular to the Wild Olympics package. You know, them saying like, hey, we don't have enough money to do like the comprehensive river management plans that are associated, and they're going to cost like this exorbitant amount of money, and we just don't have that. So therefore we can't testify positively towards this piece of legislation. And obviously that affects the legislation's chances of making it through the legislative process. So I'm not sure if we've seen that in the past quite as much. I'm just sort of sticking my toes into the appropriations arena and really learning that, like, wow, a lot of people are starting to look at that and being like, wow, we need to be more active in this arena, but we don't necessarily know how.
Yeah, on that one, I mean, we did, yeah, and I think it's interesting. We historically are active on trying to plus up the budgets for each of the federal land management agencies, you know, and both in terms of interior, but also trying to plus up the conservation budget at Forest Service. You know, Forest Service obviously sometimes can be, Forest Service and BLM are sometimes, as you guys probably know, can sometimes seen as the weak link a little bit on conservation and their mission, but I think it's interesting, you know, the issue of funding public lands and everything from our national parks on down, right, was never that much of an issue until, coincidentally enough, 2010 or 2011, in the wake of the Tea Party taking over the Congress, right? I mean, up until then, in fact, I remember, you know, once a year, a small group of Republicans used to have this off-the-record dinner with a handful of us, and they were almost all, these Republicans are almost always appropriators on the Appropriations Committee, and that's and one of the best cliches about DC is that there's three parties in Washington. There's Democrats, Republicans, and appropriators, the people who spend them, who are on the committees to spend the money, right? And so, up until the Tea Party, there wasn't much. You didn't see starvation budgets at the interior, for instance, coming out of even Republican Congresses for interior, because everybody seemed to love the Park Service and they understood how important that was. So it didn't become ideological until 2011. We just need to go back to focusing a lot more on our probes. And I think now we're in really good shape, obviously, with the Democrats in charge. But it's a good reminder that I don't think we ever did take it for granted, but we can't take it for granted. We need to be really focused on interior appropriations. And we're in really good shape again this year with the chairs of that committee, especially on the House side, Betty McCollum is chair of Interior Probes, who's a real strong champion from Minnesota. But it's interesting. I mean, one of the things you mentioned in that statement is that it's a bad bureaucrat who doesn't go to the Hill and ask for more money. I mean, it's interesting that if these guys are complaining that they don't have the money, well, go ask for more money. I mean, that's what you should. That's what government. That's what bureaucrats are supposed to do. We need more money from our agency. So I think we'll be able to correct that in the near future. The bigger issue for us, frankly, on some of this stuff is that a lot of the issues like LWCF are funded by oil and gas revenues, right? And that's the bigger challenge for us, is that we need to find a way of decoupling funding for LWCF, for instance, or other programs away from oil and gas drilling. And there's some movement to do that, and that's what it's called, decoupling, because we see the same thing in Utah with we support rural or support for rural schools and payment in lieu of taxes around forest issues. And so that's our bigger challenge, frankly, is finding ways to, whether it's user fees or other ways of raising more money outside of being dependent on fossil fuels. That's probably our bigger challenge. But I think with Democrats in charge, the funding gap for land agencies should close. But the longer term thing for us is to find a way of decoupling it from extractive industries on logging and drilling.
So Kara has another good appropriations question, but I want to bump back to Nate first because he stacked a while ago. So Nate, go ahead. What's your question?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been tangentially related to, I think you've touched on it a couple of times actually, but I am just curious as far as when you say there's, increasing resistance from the Republican side of the aisle, if you're trying to build that buy-in, what are you finding it is most helpful to focus on right now for lands protection?
Right. Well, a couple of things. One is by far the best thing is for Republicans, at least, is talking about the economic benefits of public lands, right? And that's one thing that I think people still have trouble accepting, that the outdoor economy is in the billions of dollars, right? It's no longer it's not some boutique-y fringe part of the economy. It's a huge part of the economy, and it's real important for rural communities. We've had this. We've talked about this a lot more on the Hill in relation, especially to the two Utah monuments, the Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ears, where if you're a rural community that's not on the interstate highway system, and if you don't have good broadband access, which all of these rural communities don't have, your local economy is going to suffer. But if you have a national park or a national monument or a national recreation area in your community, that's going to generate lots of revenue. And so that resonates the most with Republicans, I think, is just the economic impacts of the positive economic impacts of literally drawing lines on the map and having an area protected in their state or their congressional district. There are some Republicans who kind of understand that climate change is a big deal and is not a hoax and is an issue we need to take seriously. Mike Simpson, John Curtis, a handful of other Republicans mainly from the East kind of understand it, but that helps us a little bit because we do need to make it bipartisan, and we always try and make every one of these issues bipartisan. But so climate helps us a little bit in addition to the economic impacts. And then, sometimes depending on the issue, it becomes transactional. I referenced this with Orrin Hatch, is that Republicans who are retiring oftentimes do want a good environmental legacy. I think Orrin Hatch wanted to point to something besides a strip mine probably in Utah as one of his legacies to his grandkids. And so I think he's very proud of having these 700,000 acres in Emery County protected as wilderness. And so some of it is legacy stuff, but it's just harder. But the economic stuff always resonates more with the Republicans, and having examples. I mean, the good thing about too is some of these, like the Grand Staircase example I referenced earlier, most of the companies most of the economic activity there is small business related. People who opened a hotel or a restaurant, or people who are local guides to take people outside, or even gas station owners or people who sell camping equipment. A lot of that's local small business owners. And so that especially if we can highlight small business owners who benefit from public lands, that seems to help us with Republicans too. But it's hard. One of the big challenges I've seen in my time in Washington is it used to be that that phrase from Tip O'Neill that is famous, right? Is all politics is local. That's not true anymore. it's so much of all these political fights have been nationalized because the fundraising is done nationally, right? And so it used to be that folks had to vote their district, but now before you vote your district, you've got to check with your majority leader or the majority whip or your minority leader, minority whip on how you're going to vote on an issue. And a lot of times it's top down. And it's very rare you see Republicans buck some of their leadership unless there's a really good argument to do so. And not to get in the weeds too much on this stuff, but like I mentioned how Chaco Canyon and Grand Canyon Protection Act, those are bills that actually have passed with some bipartisan support, and some being more than 15 Republicans voting in favor of that. That's mainly because of Tom Cole from Oklahoma. And Tom Cole is one of 4 members of Congress who is a member of a federally registered tribe. You know, he's a Choctaw from Oklahoma. And so he takes his loyalty and his responsibility to the indigenous communities very seriously. And so when we passed Chaco Canyon on the floor of the House 2 years ago, the Republican majority leader was saying, don't vote. Republicans should vote against this. And Tom Cole said, no, wait, actually, this is a very important issue to me because it's important to indigenous communities in New Mexico. So he gave cover to 10 Republicans who voted with us who normally don't. And so I just highlight that as it's a challenge because so much of the stuff has become nationalized, and you've got to have someone who wants to push back on leadership. But it's harder and harder with Republicans because they've made peace with, we're going to be the anti-climate, pro-fossil fuel, anti-vaccine party, and that makes it tougher. But sometimes if you push back with the economic hook, and some people react to climate, or sometimes like with Tom Cole, you get some other arguments that work, but it's definitely harder. But the economic stuff is the best way to go with Republicans.
That's a good point. Great. So let's go to Kara's question. This is a great question about fire and appropriations. Kara, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So I am just wondering, I guess, like, given that like so much of appropriations are going to the fires every season, I'm wondering what your perspective is on what needs to change, either from an appropriation standpoint or from changing agency mandates around fire mitigation and management in order to ensure that land management agencies have the financial resources to do some of their other missions, such as recreation and land restoration.
Yeah, that's a good and hard question, right? The issue, a couple issues on that. One, you're right. I mean, that's the Forest Service has historically told us if we weren't spending all of our money on fire, and this is literally what happens. Fire season starts earlier and earlier every year, and at the Forest Service, they stop spending money on everything else and redivert money towards their fire budget. Now that should start to change because I think it was 3 years ago, we did pass the wildfire defense. It's called WDFA. What's the F stand for? I guess Wildfire Defense Forestry Act. That was another bipartisan bill. Mike Simpson was the big champion of it on the House side, and then Ron Wyden did it in the Senate. But that bill, for the first time, allows the Forest Service to tap into FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Act money, so that they can treat wildfires on federal lands the same way we treat floods and hurricanes, or our reaction to floods and hurricanes. And so the goal there was that to shield the Forest Service and the BLM from having to use conservation money or other monies for research that they were doing for fire borrowing. And so we hope that eventually that'll get some traction, and that'll allow the agencies like the Forest Service and BLM to not have to divert so much of their budget to firefighting. So we hope that WDFA will have an impact. I mean, the big challenge, of course, is the fire season is getting longer and longer. With climate change, it's going to get worse and worse. But we do think allowing those agencies to tap into other federal emergency money should help those land management agencies with their budgets.
Pete, go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. Just sort of a follow-up. You know, you've talked about the legacies that some of the leaders want to, the political leaders want to leave. So I'm wondering if there are any upcoming retirements that you're focusing on, targeting, or, you know, diving into.
Yeah, we tried to do that. It's a good question. We tried to, and it's a funny story about lobbying, right? We tried to get Lamar Alexander to do that last year before he retired. You know, someone who's a big champion on national parks, and so it was funny. This is a good inside the Beltway story, right? So I don't know if you guys know Bill Meadows. He's the former director of the Wilderness Society. Great guy, like Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, and has known Lamar for a long, hadn't known Lamar for a long time. So after we passed. So the bill that passed in 2019 was called the John Dingell Conservation Act. S47 was the bill number. And so that bill passed, I guess, in March of 2020 or 2019. And so 3 months after that bill passed, Bill Meadows went and talked to Lamar Alexander and said, hey, Lamar, you know, we'd love to have you do a conservation legacy bill, maybe do some wilderness in Great Smoky Mountains National Park as a legacy to you and your commitment to national park issues. And that could be an anchor or the bedrock for a building block for another bipartisan lands bill. And Lamar said, you think, why would Mitch McConnell let a bill like that move just because I'm retiring? And Bill Meadows had to say, well, you know, he just did that for Orrin Hatch, and you voted for that bill. Don't you remember that? And Lamar goes, no, I had no idea that was an Orrin Hatch thing. Like, no, that was completely why Lamar let that bill move, because of Orrin Hatch. And Lamar Alexander, you know, is someone who was very good friends with Mark Udall, I mean, with Tom Udall, you know, again, would meet with environmental groups. So yeah, it's harder. We're trying to figure that out. We don't know who is next on that list as someone who's retiring. You know, Lisa Murkowski is going to want some stuff. She always does, but obviously she normally wants bad stuff, which is hard. She's from Alaska. So we're open to suggestion, Pete. If you guys have any ideas of who'd be a good candidate, let me know. I mean, you know, Senator Burr from my home state, North Carolina, is someone who we've actually approached, and he basically said, look, I did the LWCF. That's all I care about. I don't want anything else. We're like, well, what about some, again, Forest Service wilderness in the Pisgah National Forest, or nah, I don't care anymore. You know, I'm retiring. I did that. So it's just, it's harder and harder to find moderates who want to do stuff. But we're looking, we're always on the lookout for some Republican who's retiring who might want a good legacy bill.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Sure, my pleasure.
Stephen, go ahead with your question.
I had a couple, but I think the first one is, well, are you guys doing anything, or are there examples of, and maybe even things that Deb Holland is doing now to include more ground-based inclusion of tribes and indigenous peoples, instead of, like, you know, we've got lots of examples of, you know, top-down bills, you know, that protect lands and stuff, but what about the other way, to better support those bills or to get work done without passing bills for inclusion and management?
Yeah, I think that is a big priority for hers, right? She's, in fact, her office told me 2 weeks ago, the person I was talking to you about, Heather Shanta, like, yeah, she's just not meeting with traditional environmental groups. Her priority is to meet with as many federally registered tribes and find what their land's priorities are. So she's made that a big priority. The issue that's going to come to the fore, I think, within the 4 years of the Biden administration is going to be whether we allow, not we, I shouldn't say that, but whether tribes are allowed to manage federal lands, right? That's the next step on the evolutionary scale. You guys probably know from Bears Ears, a 5-member intertribal council was established to help set up that management plan, but not to manage that land. And so then the next step is to allow tribes to actually manage federal lands, or to manage endangered species habitats and endangered species populations. You're seeing some of that happen. There's a little breakdown of the resistance to that in Montana, I think there's moves that, and North Dakota, South Dakota, to allow tribes, for instance, to manage bison herds in natural habitat. So I think that's an issue that's growing, and to do it just the way you talked about it, Stephen, was to allow tribes to come in to have it be ground up, not come from Washington.
Right. I mean, the Mission Mountains itself is a very historical example of how that can possibly happen, and not necessarily even outright management, but just input, like more investment and more asks from the Forest Service, like saying, you know, or the national parks or the other two agencies, like, we need your help. We need this input. It's your lands. We can't give it back to you right now, but you're here and we want you here.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
So Heather, I have a hard stop at 1, just so you know.
Totally.
So I can do one quick question.
I think we might have gotten to the end of our questions, so that's perfect timing. So thank you so much for coming on. This is so much food for thought. I really appreciate it. And all of you guys for your great questions. And we will, Athan, is it okay with you if we release the recording of this?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Cool. Great. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day. And Athan, I'll be in touch about Shantha and plans for the fall.
Thanks, y'all. Have a great day. Thanks for the invite.
Bye.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep.